This is Kofi Time.
Very few leaders ask themselves the question that they should ask all the time. What should we be doing? Not this is what we do, or this is what we've always done.
20 years ago, Kofi Annan was awarded, together with the United Nations, the Nobel Peace Prize. Regarded as one of the modern world's icons of diplomacy, what's his legacy today? How can we prepare for tomorrow based on his vision for a better world? Hello, I'm Ahmad Fawzi, and I had the pleasure and privilege of working with Kofi Annan, accompanying him on many missions around the world as one of his spokespersons and communication advisor. Today, we will discuss leadership. The world is in dire need of effective leadership, as it faces a number of urgent challenges. Our leaders seem hesitant. They squabble and point the finger at each other. I am particularly pleased to welcome today someone who knew Kofi Annan very well, a leader in his own right, Michael Møller. Michael, welcome to Kofi Time.
Thank you, Ahmad.
Michael, you've had over 35 years working within the UN system in progressively senior positions, ranging from political director in Kofi Annan's office in New York, head of the peacekeeping mission in Cyprus, Director General of the UN office in Geneva. You've also served in places like Iran, Haiti, and Mexico. A rich experience. Tell us, where and how you met Kofi Annan.
I actually met him in UNHCR. I was a young, relatively new staff member, and he had just come in to take over the Human Resources Department at that time. Worked together, and then became friends and socialized. He became my mentor, and then he met Nan, his wife, and we were friends and colleagues as well. And over the years, we had a really very strong friendship, quite apart from the fact that I worked for him on several occasions, both at the UN and in the foundation. I never accepted a job throughout my career without asking his advice first, for example. And he always gave me fantastic advice. For me, he was an incredible presence in my life, both professionally and personally. And frankly, if I have to be honest, I'm quite sure that I would never have made it as far as I did in the UN system if it hadn't been for him. From what I learned from him, being around him and traveling with him and seeing him in action. And then, of course, emulating him because he was so extraordinarily successful in what he did.
And you felt all that at the beginning?
We understood each other. I can tell you the story when it dawned on me that he was going to run for Secretary General. I was sitting in a meeting of American generals talking about Haiti. And suddenly I couldn't quite understand why he was fence-sitting on a number of issues. He used to be very clear. I think that it was when he became Secretary General, as often happens, the job creates the person, and things came up to the surface that were dormant in him and that created this extraordinary Secretary General that we had, which were not immediately apparent when you first met him 5 or 10 years earlier. It just came. The job definitely created.
I met him when he was Under Secretary General for peacekeeping. But as you say, it was very clear that he was growing with almost every day in the job.
Yes.
And he was such a good listener. I would see him in meetings if the Secretary General called a meeting on peacekeeping, on whatever it was at the time, Somalia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Herzegovina. There were so many problems at the time. He was there listening.
You mentioned the word listening. Let me tell you, it's something that I experienced quite a few times, and that really struck me. I would sit in on all the cabinet meetings when I was working on the 30th floor, his floor. And it happened several times that, as always, he would take counsel. He would set out the problem, ask for advice from the senior advisors, including all the Undersecretary Generals that were sitting around the table. And it would happen quite often that there would pretty much be consensus in the room about one particular course of action. And he would sit and listen, ponder a bit, and then take the exact opposite decision. And more often than not, he would be right. He would turn out to be right. And that always stayed with me, to be really very careful in how you analyze a problem, how you take advice, how you listen, and how you then sort of work that into a final decision and then stick with it and act on it. And he was like that, very consistently.
And how did the others in the room take it?
They took it absolutely normally. They gave their advice. They listened to what he had to say, and they went out and implemented his orders. And there was no rancor. There was no buts or ifs. They accepted the fact that the boss had spoken, and they knew from experience that very often, if not almost always, he would turn out to be right. He had this amazing political nose and very clear moral compass.
Now listen to this.
A good leader must above all have good judgment, a keen sense of what is right and what is wrong. You need discipline, you need compassion, and the individual must also be concerned about the community and about service. Leadership is about service. Good leaders must also be good listeners, and above all, a good leader must also be a good follower. A good leader cannot always be right. You cannot win all the time. Today, I get a bit worried because when you hear some of the leaders making aggressive statements, making threats at a time when we need to cooperate, at a time when the world has become so interconnected and we are dealing with problems that no one country, however powerful, can handle alone. Don't be impressed by these noises, unfortunately sometimes coming from leaders. We need to work together.
That was Kofi Annan sharing some of his reflections on leadership. Do you have any examples you can give us, Michael, to explain what kind of a leader he was?
Well, I mean, you're quite right in bringing this up, the fact that it's about serving. And when you look at the issues that he really burned for, and that he did a lot about, whether it was human rights, whether it was a fight against HIV/AIDS, whether it was other health-related issues, whether it was migration, whether it was climate change, all of these areas that had a direct and immediate impact on the populations of this planet. He addressed it with vigor, he addressed it with vision, and he addressed it in a very collaborative way to make sure that anybody and everybody who had something to bring to the solution was welcome to sit at the table where he was managing and the discussions about it forward.
Vigor, vision, and collaboration. Very important.
I would add one word that is equally important and drove him, should drive everybody, and that word is empathy. He was incredibly empathetic. He had in his heart the well-being of people everywhere, and that was what drove him.
Do you also worry about leadership in the world today?
Unfortunately, every day more. I worry about the leadership, certainly at the national level and the international level. I worry less about leadership at the lower levels of governance in the cities and the regions, where you find actually quite extraordinary politicians and leaders that provide for their citizens. But overall, I would say that the answer to your question is very sad, yes.
May I ask you why?
Well, there are several reasons. I think it's a mixture of things. First of all, the time we're in, the fact that we are faced with absolutely extraordinarily large existential problems that need to be solved. We have in most countries a structure, a political structure that is inimical to the long-term considerations and solutions that we need to find to these big existential problems. Political systems are short-term. They are 3, 4, in some countries 5 years. And the people who populate these structures either don't have the ability or certainly within those structures the possibility of taking decisions that have long-term impact and long-term implications. So we find ourselves with a growing gap between our political systems and the long-term need, the long-term solutions that we need to find for our problems of today, the challenges of tomorrow.
What would he have done if he were alive and with us today? What advice do you think he may be giving to handle some of the existential problems the world is facing today?
Well, I'm convinced that we wouldn't be in the kind of international mess in the way that we dealt with the COVID pandemic. I think if he had been around and if he had been there to kick a few heads together at the international level and convince people to coordinate and collaborate much more, and above all, to make sure that all those in need of vaccines in the South would get it much faster than they are now. We saw how he dealt with the HIV/AIDS pandemic at the time, and where he became the turning point from something really negative to something that turned out to be a positive process with access to generic drugs and a collaboration between the major pharma companies. But in this case here, I think that at the political level, the world has shown the extraordinary detrimental effects of not collaborating and not having a coordinated approach and not lining up behind the WHO and giving them the support they need to do their jobs properly. So that's one thing. I think that we would be in a different place, quite frankly, in the pandemic today if he had been here.
And as the threat of the pandemic has somewhat receded, at least for some people, at least for the time being, a new crisis has erupted, also with far-reaching consequences. The war in Ukraine, of course. Not only is it destroying a country, devastating its people, killing soldiers and civilians alike in the thousands, but it's also disrupting exports of food around the world, wheat, corn oil, and other essential foodstuff, at a time when access to food was already precarious for many people. Yet, it seems to me that very few people are talking about peace or attempting genuine negotiations between the parties, something which I firmly believe Kofi Annan would have encouraged or even tried himself. So my question is, what would you say, Michael, were the characteristics that Kofi Annan brought to mediation?
First of all, you have to understand that when somebody like Kofi Annan comes, people know that he doesn't have a personal agenda. This is not a mediator from one geographical or political side on the other. He is neutral. He's measured. People trust him. He has an extraordinary track record in peacemaking, both public and much more discreet. Leaders know that what he has done and what he can do. Also, a lot of his activities were never saw the light of publicity. So he had this. He came with a baggage already, and of course, therefore, also with very high expectations from those he tried to mediate between. But the fact is that they started out by trusting him. They asked him to come and help him. He didn't impose himself. He came with his extraordinary knowledge and expertise in matters of peacemaking and was known as the preeminent peacemaker of the planet.
Michael, there were some very stressful times for Kofi Annan during his tenure as Secretary General.
Yes.
Did he ever lose his temper?
Sometimes he would, but he would very seldomly show it. He would then go into his office and say a few choice words and be a little upset about it, but then sort of move on to it. But there was great equanimity in the way that he dealt with these issues. And when people were not delivering what they were supposed to be delivering, he would make it clear. I remember myself a couple of times where I put my nose where it wasn't supposed to be. He would call me in and explain to me that this was not the way we did things, in a very nice way, but the message was very clear and, in fact, much more effective than if you just ranted and yelled. A couple of times where this happened to me, it stayed with me for a very long time, and I never did that mistake again.
I remember actually him reprimanding me too, and I thought my job was on the block. We were in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. We had a staff meeting. I thought I wouldn't even be invited to the staff meeting, and I would be asked to pack my bags and go home. And yet I was in the staff meeting, and I was one of the first to enter the room. And he pointed that long finger at me and said very quietly, "Don't you ever do that again." And that was it. That was it. It was business as usual. Yeah. Incredible tolerance for the people around him.
I think it's tolerance, but it's also something I would call very simply people management. He was very good at that. Actually, the only time I saw him lose his temper was when we were traveling, and his wife was accompanying and had her own program. And if her program was not perfect, and if there was any hitches in the way that she was being given support, he would become very upset, and he would make it known that he was upset. You know, on all of these trips, there's always stuff that goes wrong somewhere. It's not a very precise science to organize these trips, particularly when you travel in difficult areas. And he would take whatever problems came up with equanimity and accept it, and just actually very often calm us down when we were upset about the problem. And I actually liked that in very much. You liked to be with him. He was just a nice person. And he's, as I said, very empathetic. When we were traveling, and he would meet somebody he'd met maybe years before. I don't know how he did it, but he would always remember their names. And more importantly, he would remember the names of their kids. And, you know, when somebody meets the Secretary General, and the first thing he asks you is, "How are your children?" by name, you get a very different kind of response and reflex from that person than if you just get a handshake and a normal, "How are you?" And that's part of the trust building that I was talking about earlier. He was really good at this. He was a schmoozer.
I wonder how he would react to that word.
This was another thing that always struck me. You know, he liked to walk a lot. That was his exercise. And he walked very fast and with great determination through the streets. And wherever we were, whenever we had half an hour or so, he would decree a walk, and some of us would go with him. And, you know, whether it was in favelas, whether it was in the streets of Vienna, all of a sudden there would be crowds clapping and yelling his name. And you know, sometimes it was like if I was walking around the city with the Rolling Stones or somebody. And it was really like, it was quite extraordinary at times. And he would stop and talk to them. And there was a very clear rapport between the crowd, and particularly young people who mostly were there, and himself. And he accepted it, and he accepted having pictures taken. He was very open and very engaging with people, which all, again, was part of his persona and part of his image and his identity. Open and welcoming.
I do remember him using a strong word, in fact, 2 words, once during the Oil for Food program. What were they? When someone asked whether he was considering stepping down?
Hell no. The Oil for Food program was one of the really trying times in his Secretary Generalship. It was an extraordinarily tough moments for him, several months, where he showed amazing resilience and amazing grace. But he did lose his voice for several months, where he could barely speak. He was attacked both professionally and personally through his family. It was relentless and it was brutal. But he came out of it, you know, at the other end, in many ways reinforced, I think. And the respect that people had for him, for the way that he dealt with it and the way he came through, was really quite big.
You mentioned earlier that you would never have made it without him. You were young then.
Younger.
You were young. You were younger then, pardon me, Mr. Under-Secretary General. How relevant is he to young people today then?
You know, I think that he is just as relevant today, and in many ways, perhaps even more, because he was really the moral voice of our generation. And this is a voice that in today's world, today's fragmented world with the massive existential problems that are facing us, is missing. And so I think that his values, his voice as well, of course, when you hear his voice, it's a very distinctive voice and one that inspires trust and respect, I think speaks to young people today. They are looking for these values. They're looking for somebody who can tell them where we should all be going. And he did that very effectively on a whole series of issues.
So if I can mention the leadership qualities that Kofi Annan displayed over the years, I would say moral steadfastness, very acute political acumen, resilience, empathy, openness, tolerance. He was such a good listener. He had a lot of grace, and he was very good at people management. Thank you, Michael, for sharing these stories and your words of wisdom with us, and for helping us understand better who Kofi Annan was and why his legacy is so important to us today. To conclude, I'd like to play a short recording of Hajar Sharif, a young lady leader herself from Libya, who worked with Kofi Annan as part of his Extremely Together initiative. She was speaking at the memorial ceremony a few weeks after Kofi Annan had passed away.
For many of us, Kofi Annan and the UN were not two separate things. Kofi Annan is not the past, he is the future. His spirit will live on through the countless young people he inspired.
You've been listening to Kofi Time. Wherever you are, share the values that Kofi Annan represented that you think are relevant today using #Kofi Time. Kofi Time is brought to you by the Kofi Annan Foundation and the United Nations Information Service in Geneva. Produced by Gianluca Alaria. Please join me again for the next episode of Kofi Time.